It was only 1,000 years ago that our ancestors had to deal with the final world catastrophe that would set the stage for how we live today. Before this final catastrophe, our ancestors had finally found themselves living in a state of relative peace. The turmoil from the previous cataclysm had long since faded. The previous world catastrophe had twisted the earth, raised mountains overnight, and sunk continents. The survivors were scant, but held strong. The Venus event had passed, and the survivors from lost cultures all over the world began to rebuild. However, there was to be one more catastrophe, one more mega-destructive event that would set the stage for how we exist today. This event would be responsible for the Earth's current wobble. It would be responsible for our 365-day calendar. It would be responsible for Earth's current orbit around the Sun. Around 1,000 years ago, our ancestors had rebuilt civilization, but that was about to come to an end. While the tumultuousness of the solar system had calmed significantly, it had not completely stopped. There was still one more rogue planetary body that was attempting to find its final orbit that it currently sits in today. And that planet's name is Mars, the god of war. Mars would usher in the final catastrophe that our ancestors suffered from and from which we are now the descendants. This final catastrophe will be called
The Zero Event.
This thesis aims to examine a major catastrophic event in Earth's history, marking the final large-scale planetary upheaval before the advent of modern civilization and the recorded historical era. Unlike the Venus event, which significantly reshaped the planet, this event set the stage for the current geographic and temporal systems. The primary celestial body involved in this upheaval was the planet Mars, which made a close approach to Earth, triggering profound geophysical and chronological changes. The encounter resulted in several key transformations, including a temporary slowdown of Earth's rotation, a shift in geographic latitudes, and a recalibration of the calendar from a 360-day to a 365-day year. Additionally, significant alterations to Earth's surface occurred, such as the submersion of shorelines and islands, as well as potential land uplifts. One of the most notable geological consequences of this event was the formation of the Dead Sea, which submerged 5 cities, including Sodom and Gomorrah. While the electromagnetic properties of Mars during this event remain uncertain, it is a fact that electromagnetism in general played a large role in the Zero event. Using real science, history, and chronology, this study explores the implications of this Martian interaction and its role in shaping the Earth's final geophysical and chronological transition into the modern age. The mainstream's version of history is rather odd. For some weird reason, humans seem to start at a very high technical skill level only 5,000 years ago. As time passes, for some odd reason, humans begin to degrade. All of those skills are lost. All of those mega constructions are no longer built. Civilizations everywhere, for some reason, degrade into a lower state of existence. Then, over time, humans pick themselves back up and have brought civilization back to what we would consider a high level of technology. Why is it that our ancestors appear to have lost tons of knowledge in a very quick period of time? What happened in the past that would create a situation to where a higher level civilization would suddenly disappear? Or at the very least, degrade into going back into mud huts and straw housing? What happened in our past? What would it take to bring all of humanity down to its knees? Our ancestors tell us. The thesis of the zero event simply listens to what all of our ancestors recorded, and to combine those histories with real science. This thesis has the potential to answer major historical enigmas and other scientific problems. Problems such as, why does the Earth have its wobble? Why is the Earth currently at its 23.5-degree tilt? Why do we have a situation to where our ancestors have had multiple different calendars? And how did we end up with a 365-day calendar? Other questions, such as, where did all of these recent civilizations go? Why do we find entire cities buried underwater? Why do we have a situation to where there are multiple dark ages proposed in the middle of mainstream chronology? What happened in human history that brought us to the point that we are at today? We now find ourselves in a position to where we may have many answers to a lot of these questions. And while the research continues, the zero event is at the very least a beginning of understanding a very particular point in human history. And this point in human history laid the foundation for all of civilization now. The zero event thesis is an attempt to put together a picture of the last major cataclysm that struck this planet. Mainstream chronology is wrong. Mainstream historians continue to believe in a lie. They believe that they have all of human history generally mapped out, upwards to 5,000 years or beyond. Modern historians take a subjective approach to the sciences. Modern historians have built an entire chronology out of supposed ancient works. Works that are not allowed to be subjugated to any tests outside of their institutions. Modern historians have fabricated an entire chronology that is designed to do one thing: to ensure that you never discover the truth. If this thesis is going to make any sense to anybody, we have to understand that modern chronology is not just slightly wrong, but that it is entirely wrong. that modern chronology holds no answers for anybody, that modern chronology has been calibrated on nothing. Once we discard modern chronology, human history suddenly completely changes. Not only does human history completely change, but now when we look back at the mythologies, the stories, the histories of our ancestors, all of those recountings suddenly start to make more sense. Suddenly, we will find connections where originally we were taught there could never be a connection. Once you discard mainstream chronology, all of history starts to come together. But the picture that it paints is completely different than anything most people are prepared to understand. All I ask of the listener is to remain objective. This thesis is not based on some kind of a theory that I am trying to prove. Instead, all I am doing here is taking the evidence that we all have access to and simply following them to whatever conclusions they may point us towards. Instead of relying on a mainstream interpretation of history, we will simply take our ancestors' stories at face value. Instead of trusting the so-called experts in modern-day science and history, we will question all of their results, even the conclusions that seem unchallengeable. Conclusions such as the claim that the planets in our solar system have maintained their current orbits for over 4+ billion years. Is that conclusion scientifically accurate? When we put it to the test, when we apply the scientific method, we very quickly discover that there is no reason to make that claim. As we challenge paradigms, we will discover that many of what the mainstream holds as true falls apart even with the most basic scientific questioning. We very quickly watch as all of mainstream science and history collapses around us. Even the most basic questions destroys mainstream's worldview. This thesis is only following the evidence. The world we live in right now is a direct result of what happened around 1,000 years ago. Around this time, Earth had a close encounter with the planet Mars.
When the red star shines bright and moves in the sky, the warriors watch, for it is a sign. The gods do not place it without reason. It tells of struggle, of times when men must rise. The stars do not always bring peace. The gods send signs, and the warriors know them. The red star is among them, and when it moves with power, the people must listen.
That is a quote from the mythology of the Pawnee Indians. They are very clear when they state what they see. Modern academics listen to the word red star and they believe that it is just some kind of a fictional god, something that the Indians just worshipped because they did not know better. No. The Pawnee knew exactly what they were talking about, and the Pawnee recorded exactly what they saw. The red star was Mars. The red star known as Scarface, as the god of battle. When Mars began to approach Earth, humans all over the planet paid attention. In ancient Rome and Greece, we find Ares filling the same role as the red star for the Pawnee.
Ares the Destroyer rages in the sky, bearing the blood of warriors.
Babylonian and Mesopotamian cultures also speak of Mars. Here he is called Nergal.
When the red star is bright, the gods speak, and war follows.
In the Hindu and Vedic traditions, we find the same thing. We find Mars called Mangala, and he is associated with war, aggression, and fiery destruction.
Mangala's fire burns strong, and his gaze brings forth warriors.
In Norse mythology, we find the same thing. We find the Norse associating Mars with Tyr, the god of war and battle strategy. A Norse rune says this:
The Red Wanderer moves. War follows in its path.
In Chinese astrology and mythology, we find Mars called Ying Hao, meaning the fiery light. He was often an omen of war or disaster. Ancient Chinese texts recorded,
Yin Hao burns in the heavens. The Emperor must be aware.
In South America, we find the Mayans tracking Mars's long cycles. They associated these cycles with conflict and upheaval. Mayan texts quote,
The red star moves. The people sharpen their spears.
The Aztecs also link Mars to Huitzilopochtli, their god of war. In Egyptian mythology, we find Mars being connected to Set, the god of chaos, war, and storms. Egyptian astronomers noted that Mars's movements aligned with political and military conflicts. Ancient Egyptian texts quote,
The Red One walks among the gods, and disorder rises.
Are you seeing the pattern yet? The Zulu and African sky traditions also ascribe Mars as a harbinger of war or struggle. The Xhosa believed that Mars's red light meant the ancestors were speaking to warriors. The Zulu oral tradition states,
When the red star is high, the warriors prepare their shields.
Persian and Zoroastrian traditions also contain references to Mars. In Zoroastrian astrology, Mars is known as Bahram, the spirit of victory and battle. Persian texts read,
Bahram walks above, and the swords of men will follow.
Without worrying about dates, we have a problem. Why do we have a situation to where cultures all over this planet suddenly revere Mars, or fear Mars, as the god of war? Why is it that these cultures also worry about the arrival of Mars, as it also brings destruction and devastation? Why is it that all of these cultures have identical stories related to what should only be a small point of light in the sky? What is going on? For a mainstream historian, there is no satisfactory answer. So the problem is essentially ignored. However, the problem actually has a solution, and it's a solution that is right in front of everybody's faces. The only reason why it is not used is because we are all taught to ignore the solution. Our ancestors recorded the reason why They all meticulously tracked the planet Mars. Their histories explain everything. Looking up at our present night sky, we will not find any answers. All of our ancestors record Mars being a destroyer, being a god of strife, bringing war, and in some cases, pestilence. When we look up at the night sky today, Mars does none of this. So it begs the question, why is it that all of our ancestors record Mars doing all of these events, being responsible for all of this destruction and war, when it is nothing but a small point of light in the sky? Something has to be going on. An objective look over all of the texts or the verbal histories will immediately highlight an aspect of the stories that mainstream historians have completely ignored. And that is that none of these cultures claim that Mars is a small point of light in the sky. No culture says that it is a little dot that is sitting up there among all the other stars. Instead, these cultures describe the planet Mars for what it is: a planetary cosmological body in our solar system. To make this even more interesting, there are cultures that actually have descriptions of the surface of Mars. The Skitty Pawnee are well aware of Mars's Valles Marineris. They call Mars Scarface. This story is repeated all over the world. How did they know about the Great Scar on Mars? Did they all have telescopes back in the day? A mainstream historian will of course say no, and I agree with them. We have no reason to believe that all of these cultures had strong enough telescopes to track the planet and see any kind of a feature on its surface. The answer is comically simple, however, we have been trained to ignore it. If you are able to see the features on a planet, if you can see the geological makeup of the planet, that means the planet must have been closer at some point in time in history. And of course, that is exactly what our ancestors describe. Now, at the beginning of this introduction to this thesis, I mentioned that we have to question the concept of the solar system remaining in its current configuration for 4 billion years into the past. We have no scientific reason to believe that that is the case at all. So, when we look at the stories of all of the cultures all over this planet describing Mars in detail and describing an orbit that does not match the orbit of today, the only scientifically based conclusion that we can reach is that Mars had a different orbit just 1,000 years ago. I realize how insane that sounds. But let me ask you this. Why does it sound so insane? There is nothing unscientific about the claim. Planetary bodies orbit each other at relatively close distances every single day. Look no further than to our own sky. The moon is a planetary body. The moon is relatively close to Earth. And yet we're fine. Everybody goes about their day and nothing changes. The worst effect that Earth feels is the potential of tidal forces. A planetary body can absolutely come close to Earth without having absolute destruction happen to the two bodies. This is an observable fact. Now, our ancestors do not record peaceful times when the planet Mars intersected orbits with the Earth. They record times of devastation, of plague, of destruction, and of war. While some of this is odd, the war portion in particular, the destruction and the devastation and the plagues and the chaos is not such a mystery. If another planetary body got close enough to the planet Earth, we would expect the Earth to be physically manipulated, and of course, this is exactly what our ancestors record. Why would our ancestors record anything about Mars doing anything to the planet Earth out of nowhere? There is no reason for even one culture on this planet to waste their time creating stories about Mars causing damage to the Earth, and yet they all do. They do this because they were recording the scientific effects of another planetary body passing close by. To corroborate all of the destruction that took place during these crossings, look no further to every single culture's past. Wherever we go that we find the god of war causing strife, wars, and destruction, that is where we will find the zero event. During these events, this is what would change the course of history. We have entire nations going to war in the shadow of Mars passing by overhead. The Trojan War is fought during this period of time. Sennacherib's army is also destroyed by the passing of planet Mars. In China, the Duke of Liu Yang was at war against the Han. It is during this time that the Duke is supposed to call the sun back up into the sky after it had already set. This is another example of war being fought while a planetary body is having massive effects on the planet Earth. What this also displays to us is that a planetary body passing close by does not mean ultimate destruction. On the other side of the planet, we find other cultures who talk about a time when the night lasted longer, to where, for some weird reason, the Earth seemed to come to a standstill. Why do cultures all over this planet describe these events perfectly during this exact period in time? The answer is simple. They are all recounting the events that they experienced. Passing by Earth, the planet Mars would usher in the destruction of other civilizations who would not survive the event. Civilizations who we now have their ruins, but we mislabel them as some other civilization. We do this because we have no records of what actually happened to them because they were obliterated. Depending on where you were on the planet during these events, you would find yourself dealing with a multitude of different problems. This fact that is recorded all over this planet is a huge piece of evidence that proves that Mars did at least one flyby of the planet Earth. The ramifications for the cataclysmic event of Mars passing Earth can be seen all over this planet. All we have to do is implement real chronology, and then we rewind the clock and we find a time to where cultures everywhere are pulling themselves out of various degrees of destruction. We find other places to where cultures, in order to survive, have to band together. Cultures which had originally been at war. The major reason why so many lost civilizations don't make sense to both mainstream historians and alternative historians is because nobody is looking at the situation as our ancestors describe it. For example, why do we find a situation to where supposedly ancient Roman buildings are covered with dozens of feet of mud and dirt? In some cases, we have civilizations covered under hundreds of feet of debris. What was going on? The mainstream has no explanation for this other than the concept of cultural layers. A ridiculous explanation given the patterns of erosion. These civilizations were wiped out overnight. These civilizations died just as our ancestors said they did. There is no reason to make anything up. We can simply listen to what they have stated. Once we do that, we can now find the period in time to where history as we know it now begins. We have not suffered a major cataclysm since that point in time. If you are wondering why not, the answer is simple. The solar system has now settled into its current situation. This would have been inevitable, and we just happen to live in this time period. We do not need millions and billions of years for this to happen. The electromagnetic force is 10 to the 38 times more powerful than gravity. Electricity self-sorts, and it does it quickly. The solar system has now essentially sorted itself out. However, make no mistake, we are not in a state of perfect equilibrium. We are simply in a state of current calm, which could potentially change at any point in time. Just 1,000 years ago, our ancestors suffered from the last major catastrophe. Once we acknowledge this destruction, history will start to make sense. We can begin to get rid of ridiculous concepts like the Dark Ages, or some sort of mystical ancient Grecian period in time which never existed. We can look around the planet and we can see human migrations start to make sense. Looking at DNA, we can now make a completely different conclusion as to why all of the cultures mixed the way they did. We do not need archaic concepts that mainstream historians currently push forward. We do not need any of this. Our histories are completely different. Mainstream chronology is wrong. The Zero Event is an attempt at explaining all of these recent mysteries that bog down history. We will use science, and we will listen to our ancestors, and we will try to paint a real picture of what happened in our past, no matter how insane it sounds.